A compelling detective story, a cloak and dagger action, and a romantic drama, all these stories were taken from real life. The history of Kazakhstan is inseparable from the world history. Reflections on history, our version.
Walking around the world, Amangeldy. The cinema-goers were watching the film, now crying out with surprise, now becoming indignant, now falling silent in awe. What a pity that cinematography could not convey green jungles, blue seas, seagulls, sounds or noisy nights in big cities. Amangeldy was turning the stick of a motion picture projector, recalling his 4-year journey around the world. He showed where he had been. He traveled across Kazakhstan. He started the journey in native Turgai and then went to Kyzylorda and Turkestan. He moved and showed the film until it became forbidden. It was the first film shown in the Kazakh steppe. The rare footage of the unique journey included a can-can danced at the Moulin Rouge, feeding lions in a zoo, biplane flying over a field, and Eskimos dressing a seal. It was the first journey of its kind, and it was the only one. Nikolai Stepanov, who was also known as Amangeldy, a member of the World Tour, which was not provided for, was studying at the Moscow Theological Academy in 1910. He was the first Kazakh who made a world tour at that time. He was the first Kazakh cinematographer. In this regard, Amangeldy was a unique person. Chapter 1. A Journey with Ellipsis. He had to leave Moscow, which had almost become his native city over the period when he studied there. Intuition rarely deceived Amangeldy, known as Stepanov, when studying at the theological seminary. Being devoted to revolution, the young man realized that he was unlikely to remain free another search. He looked around the small room which had rent together with his friends and wrote the following on a sheet of paper. Notice, I, Nikolai Stepanov, I am going on a world tour and looking for traveling companions. He had a friend called Nikolai Petrov. As they studied together, he took the name of Nikolai too. 3 people responded to the call: a science teacher from Samara, a process engineer from St. Petersburg, and Moscow Commercial College teacher. It was in July 1910 in Moscow. Amangeldy was wearing a short jacket, a soft felt hat, sports shoes, and a traveling bag was behind his back. He had 25 rubles and a camera. They covered the distance from Moscow to St. Petersburg on foot. They covered 40 to 50 kilometers a day. Of course, in the beginning they went slowly because they lacked the training. The World Tour members became famous and newspapers followed their journey. The travelers organized chargeable evenings and gave lectures in cities they passed through, which allowed them to earn money for food. They crossed the first line or border, to be exact. Nikolai Stepanov, a traveler not provided with means and traveling around the world on foot for the sake of scientific education, left Warsaw on the 10th of August 1910. They did not have any scientific or sports aims. They just decided to visit as many countries as possible and see as many sights as possible. Prague is a city of castles. It can be called a record holder. There are more than 2,000 grand constructions there. He wrote only a couple of words about Prague. The information about whether the traveller crossed Charles Bridge and took photos of the old town did not remain. It is strange that Amangeldy did not say much about many cities. Moulin Rouge was like a weapon of the revolutionary propaganda. Amangeldy edited his film in such a way that people could see the difference between wild and jolly Parisian life at night and heavy work of Turkish dockers. Girls in short skirts and black stockings performed high kicks and stepped on the audience. Steppe dwellers' reaction to this show was sharp. How could they allow this abuse? He did not write anything else about Paris. The World Tour member kept silence about his journey to Spain and other countries. It was not possible to understand all the stamps in the traveller's book either. He mentioned in passing that he had met Lenin in Switzerland in the original of his reminiscences. Meeting Lenin was the most complicated story in the journey. This event had continuation and was worthy of a separate story itself. Incidentally, Alabi narrated all the other events in details. During the daytime, I took photos of the places I visited, and at night I developed photos, earned a living by delivering lectures and presenting reports and selling photos. When Jangildin was in Moscow, he learned of photography, and this skill saved him many times. Photos of the traveller himself, and for example, photos of St. Stephen's Cathedral, Hofburg Palace and Schönbrunn Palace were sold at about half a kopeck each, which provided money for the expedition budget. He wrote that he and his friends had separated in Austria to Hungary. He went to the east while they remained in Europe. According to Morris Simachko, a writer, one of Alabi's companions was a secret police agent, but let's concentrate on the details. Chapter 2. The New Vambri. The story ended in Budapest, where according to Simachko, the travellers were welcomed very warmly. Alabi was provided with a 2-story suite with a garden at the expense of the Royal Society for Study of Hungarian History. Everybody called Alabi a brother. Taking into account his Kipchak region, he really was one of the Kipchak people. Newspapers wrote that he was a new Vambri who had been a famous Hungarian traveller. Armin Vambri went to Central Asia in order to find the Hungarians' homeland, which was in his primary aim. His exploration of Central Asia started with it. Alabi read a lot about Vambri. That person had studied almost 3 languages in the world. He was so fluent in Eastern languages that having disguised himself as a dervish, he could cross Western Asia and Central Asia, and everywhere people thought that he was one of them. At that time, Vambri was still alive, but was not in his homeland. The 80-year-old scientist had gone to Great Britain, where he lived as a guest of the Queen for many years. It is interesting that the portraits of the 2 travellers hung near each other in Budapest. A big reception was held for Jangildin in Budapest. He met the local high society and was offered to remain there. The only portrait of Jangildin remained. It was placed in a national museum, the main museum of the country. The caption says, "A certain traveller visited our city on September the 30th, 1910. Probably Alabi thought they had so much in common, with the Kipchak tribes had gone there to serve the Hungarian king in the 13th century. But even today, on the way back to the Danube, he saw coloured felts and names of some villages were similar to Kazakh ones. The fact that all the Turkic-speaking people and Hungarians are related has been known for a long time. Kinship ties remain. Even 7 to 8 centuries later, he referred to the origins of kinship. Jangildin became an honorary member of the Royal Society for Study of the Hungarian History, also known as Vambri House. Alabi promised to send his records to them. However, he suddenly left the country early in the morning in autumn. Keeping it secret from his companions and leaving possible shadowing behind, the traveller arrived in Serbia and went to Constantinople from there. Chapter 3. An Eastern Kaleidoscope. I was in Constantinople on November the 2nd, 1910. The noisy, multicoloured and colourful East, where you could hear different voices and languages, amazed me on the first day I arrived there. It was impossible to break away from this place. He had to work as a docker in the port of Varna in order to be able to get to New Rome and Istanbul. Alabi stayed in a small cafe and walked through narrow streets looking for interesting views for a whole month. There are always a lot of tourists here because this tower was built at the time of the Byzantine Empire. Later, at the time of the Ottoman Empire, its construction was completed. Later, it was used as a fire watchtower for some time. Amangeldy did not take photos either of this ancient tower called Galata or Tokapi Palace, or even the famous Hagia Sophia, because the photographs of the sites were sold at every corner. Ali brought 40 rolls of film. It isn't the camera which he used to take photos, but his personal camera. Of course, this equipment is more modern. It is much smaller than the box which was with him. When he was traveling halfway across the world, the traveler had a lot of equipment, including the camera itself, a tripod, and a movie camera. Incidentally, it had been invented 15 years before he started his journey. The sales of cameras for amateur photographers started only in 1899 in Great Britain. 10 years after, Ali took photos of the Sphinx and the Great Pyramid. A special guide led me through the cool halls of the tomb of a once mighty pharaoh. I ascended the colossal ledges of the pyramid and went back in the same way. He dedicated a lot of pages to Egypt, said about visiting Mamluk tombs in Cairo, wrote a couple of words about the Wailing Wall in Israel, and of course about Mecca and Medina. He could not take his equipment there because in Cairo they had warned him that if his camera was noticed, he would immediately be executed. He went the following route. He made the Hajj to Mecca, then he went to Medina. He described it in a way which was appropriate at the Soviet time. He mentioned that he had passed the Kaaba stone, but did not write that he had made the Hajj. It is clear why he kept it secret. The Communist Party leader had to be an atheist. It is explicable why he emphasized how the poor people lived abroad. Nevertheless, he was welcomed warmly and people of different social classes helped everyone. Amangeldy mentioned famous Shamil's son in his diary. On the way back, Ali was invited to the coronation of the King of Siam in Bangkok. On the way back, I went through the Arabian Peninsula, Africa, Persia, India, Ceylon, the Indian subcontinent, Siamese Kingdom, Amman, southern China, and the island of Formosa. In late 1912, I arrived in Japan. He lived almost a year in Japan. He filmed commercials and earned money to buy a film projector, which he brought with him to Turgai steppes. Hundreds of people gathered in the room. First they were afraid, thinking that it was Satan's action. I explained to them that a photograph is developed thanks to a chemical substance. I showed them how Indian, Chinese and Spanish workers worked. At the same time, I showed that we treated workers even worse. Epilogue: Withdrawn archives. It is impossible to tell you everything because there were many matters he did not mention himself. For example, it was a miracle that he avoided arrest as a Japanese spy in fatal 1937. He was saved due to a happy chance. Having found out that they were going to arrest him, Amangeldy went to Moscow and managed to meet Kalinin. His son explained. A document which prohibited touching Amangeldy was sent from Moscow. It could be from Kalinin or somebody else. Anyway, it was from the KGB. The most interesting fact is that it is unknown where those films and artifacts are. Where are those priceless materials? Most likely they are gathering dust in the archives. At least Amangeldy mentioned in his diary that they had tried to take his film projector and films a few times in 1916, but were not successful. After that, Ali stopped mentioning them in his diaries. Nobody saw them after the revolutionary's death in August 1953. They literally arrived on the following day or after the funeral, or even immediately after my father died, and took his whole archive. In In spite of the underlying political causes, it probably was the most unique journey in world history. It was made by a dweller of the Turgai steppe, a professional photographer, a cameraman, and in addition, a revolutionary hero. Amangeldy walked around the world on foot.